What nobody in that auction room knew, not the bidders in their tailored suits, not the auctioneer with his polished patter, not the man who had driven the piece there himself, was that the violin sitting inside that battered case had once belonged to a concert hall that burned to the ground in 1943. And the only person who had figured that out was a mechanic from Denton, Texas, who smelled like motor oil and had grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. By the time the hammer came down, Walter Pruitt's life had already changed. The man who sold him that case for $40 was still standing in the parking lot of his own shop watching the live stream on his phone, unable to speak. Walter Pruitt had not planned to stop at Kellner Fine Instruments that Tuesday morning. He had planned to drop his daughter off at school, stop at the hardware store for a replacement belt on Mrs. Albrecht's riding mower, and get back to the shop before 9. That was the plan. But Serena had asked him to take the long way, the one that went past the old brick buildings on Caldwell Street, because she liked the way the light hit them in the morning. She was 7. She noticed things like that. Her mother had been the same way. So Walter took the long way, and that was how he ended up idling at the intersection across from Kellner Fine Instruments, when the door swung open and a man in a cream-colored shirt began dragging boxes out onto the sidewalk. He would have kept driving. He almost did, but one of the boxes tipped, and the lid came off, and Walter saw the corner of a case, dark wood, the kind of dark that comes not from paint but from age, slide halfway out onto the concrete. The man in the cream-colored shirt didn't even look down. He shoved it back in with his foot. Walter pulled over. He told himself later that it was just curiosity, that he had always liked old things, that his father had kept a fiddle on the wall of their house in Odessa, and Walter had grown up knowing what a real instrument looked like, even if he'd never learned to play one. He told himself all of that. Maybe some of it was even true. He crossed the street. The man in the cream-colored shirt was Conrad Kellner. Walter would learn his full name later. At the time, he only knew him as the man who looked up from the boxes, looked Walter over once. The work boots, the Carhartt jacket, the general appearance of someone who worked with his hands for a living, and went back to what he was doing without saying a word. "Morning," Walter said. Conrad Kellner straightened up. He was somewhere in his early 50s, with the kind of permanent tan that comes from golf rather than labor, and a watch on his wrist that probably cost more than Walter's truck. He smiled the way people smile when they've already decided they're not interested in a conversation. "We're closed," he said, clearing out some inventory. "Estate. Overflow. That a violin case?" Walter asked. Conrad Kellner looked at the box, then back at Walter. "It's junk," he said. "Old student instrument. The bow's missing, there's a crack along the top plate, and the pegs are seized. I've had it in the back for 3 years and nobody's touched it. I'm done carrying it. Can I look at it?" Something shifted in Conrad Kellner's expression. Not warmth, more like calculation. He pulled the case out of the box and held it out. Walter took it. He set it on the hood of a car that was parked at the curb. Not his car, but nobody said anything, and opened it. The velvet lining was faded to a brownish red, the color of dried roses. The instrument lay in the shaped cutout the way old things lie when they've been in one place long enough to leave an impression. Walter didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at it. He looked at the scroll, the way the wood grain ran across the top, the color of the varnish in the places where the varnish remained. "How much?" he said. Conrad Kellner shrugged. $40. I just want it gone." Walter paid him in cash, 2 20s from his wallet, and put the case in the back seat of his truck. Conrad Kellner had already turned back to his boxes before Walter reached the corner. He didn't open it again until that night. Serena was in bed. The shop was quiet. Walter sat at the kitchen table with the case in front of him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, and he opened it the way you open something when you have time to pay attention. He lifted the instrument out carefully, cradling the neck in his left hand, the way his father had taught him to hold things that mattered. He turned it in the light. The crack Conrad Kellner had mentioned was there, A hairline split along the upper bout, starting from the F-hole and running about 3 centimeters toward the shoulder. Repairable. Walter had seen worse. He'd seen a lot worse, actually, in the 20 years he'd spent fixing things other people had given up on. He looked inside through the F-hole, angling the instrument toward the lamp. There was a label. Most instruments had labels. Most labels meant nothing. They were printed copies, decorative, added by dealers and students and optimists. Walter had known that since he was 12. But he looked anyway, because his father had told him to always look. The label was handwritten, not printed, handwritten in ink that had faded to a pale brown, in script so small he had to get his reading glasses. He could make out a year. He could make out what looked like a city, not a city he recognized at first. He photographed it with his phone, enlarged the image, stared at it for a long time. Then he went to his laptop. He was not a scholar. He was not a historian. He was a mechanic from Denton, Texas, who had grown up watching his father take things apart and put them back together. But he knew how to research, the same way he knew how to diagnose an engine problem, methodically, without assumptions, following what he could see instead of what he expected to find. He was still at the laptop at 2 in the morning. What Walter found over the following days was this. In the late 1930s, a luthier named August Ferrer had worked in a small atelier in the city of Dresden. He had been a student of a student of a student in a lineage that serious collectors spent careers tracing. He had made perhaps 40 instruments in his lifetime. Because he worked slowly and refused to compromise, 31 of those instruments were documented and accounted for. The remaining 9 had been lost, to the war, to displacement, to the particular cruelty that history applies to beautiful things. One of the 9 was described in a letter, written in 1947 by a German-American cellist named Ernst Brauer, as having been sold hastily in 1942 to an American soldier passing through, a sergeant from Texas who had paid $20 for it because he didn't know what it was and the seller needed the money. The letter was in an archive. Walter found a scanned copy on the website of a university library in Leipzig. He printed it out and read it 3 times. Then he looked at the label in the violin again. He couldn't be certain. He knew he couldn't be certain. He was a mechanic, not an appraiser, and he had spent enough years fixing things to know the difference between what you thought and what you could prove. But the year matched, the handwriting style matched what he'd found in other documented Ferrer instruments. There were photographs, detailed ones, in a German auction catalog from 2019. The varnish color, what remained of it, matched the descriptions. He called the shop where he'd bought it. Conrad Kellner answered on the 3rd ring. "I bought a violin from you last week," Walter said. "The one in the old case, $40. "I remember," Conrad Kellner said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had already decided this conversation wasn't worth his time. "I think it might be more valuable than you realized," Walter said. "I'd like to talk to you about, sir." Conrad Kellner's voice didn't change. "That instrument was sold as is. The transaction is complete. I have nothing further to discuss with you." "I'm not asking for my money back," Walter said. "I'm just, have a good day." The line went dead. Walter sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. He set it down on the workbench next to the violin case. He looked at the case. He thought about Serena asleep upstairs, and the way she'd asked him that morning at breakfast whether they could get a dog, and the way he'd had to explain, carefully, that dogs needed a yard, and their yard needed a new fence, and the fence would have to wait a little longer. He thought about the way she had nodded. Seriously, the way she always nodded when he explained something to her, because she understood that things took time and she had been raised to understand it. He thought about her mother, then he picked up the phone again and started making calls. The first appraiser he reached told him to bring it in. The second one, after Walter described what he'd found, told him to bring it in immediately and to wrap it in something soft and not to let it out of his sight. The woman who met him at the door of the appraisal firm on Thursday morning was named Beverly Crane, and she had spent 30 years authenticating stringed instruments for auction houses in New York, London, and Vienna. She was small, precise, and utterly without small talk. She took the violin out of the case, the way surgeons pick up instruments, and she did not speak for 11 minutes. Walter counted. When she finally looked up, her expression was the same as when she'd started, careful, measured, giving nothing away. "Where did you get this?" she said. He told her. All of it. The long way to school, the boxes on the sidewalk, the $40, the label, the Leipzig archive, the 2019 auction catalog. Beverly Crane listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked back at the violin. "I can't confirm provenance from one session," she said. "This will take time. I'll need to do dendrochronology, varnish, eclasis, and reach out to 2 colleagues in Europe. This could take 3 weeks. How likely is it?" Walter asked. She looked at him for a long moment. "The handwriting is consistent," she said. "The wood dating will tell us more. But if it is what you think it is," she paused. "There was a Ferrer that sold at Bonham's in 2021 for just under $900,000. That was a documented one." Walter nodded. "An undocumented one," Beverly Crane said, "with a verified provenance story, a Texas soldier, a Dresden atelier, a letter in a Leipzig archive. That's not a liability. That's a narrative. And in this market, a narrative can be worth more than the instrument itself." The 3 weeks were the hardest Walter could remember since the year after his wife died. He went to work, he fixed engines, he dropped Serena at school and picked her up and made dinner and listened to her tell him about her day. He did not tell her what was happening, because he did not know yet what was happening, and he had learned from the years of raising her, from the years before that, not to make promises he couldn't keep. He called Beverly Crane once a week. She gave him updates in the same measured way she did everything. Dendrochronology consistent with 1930s and 1940s German spruce. Varnish compounds consistent with documented Ferrer instruments. Her colleague in Munich had reviewed the photographs and asked to see the instrument in person. "That's a good sign," Beverly Crane told him. "He doesn't ask to see things unless he thinks they're worth seeing." Walter said thank you and went back to work. In the 4th week, Conrad Kellner called him. Walter didn't recognize the number at first. He almost let it go to voicemail. "I heard you had that violin appraised," Conrad Kellner said. His voice had changed. The flatness was gone, replaced by something Walter recognized, a particular kind of forced calm that people use when they are not calm at all. "I did," Walter said. "I'd like to discuss a purchase. I'll give you $5,000 for it. Today, cash, no paperwork." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Why would I sell it to you for $5,000? "Because the appraisal process is long and expensive, and there are no guarantees," Conrad Kellner said. "Because you're a working man, and $5,000 is $5,000. Walter thought about the way Conrad Kellner had looked at his work boots on the sidewalk that morning. The way he'd smiled. The way he'd said the word junk with a particular kind of certainty, the certainty of a man who had decided, before Walter even opened his mouth, what kind of person he was dealing with. "I appreciate the offer," Walter said. "I'll pass." Conrad Kellner's voice went very quiet. "I want you to understand that I have resources you don't. If there's a legal question about this sale." "The sale was completed," Walter said. "You told me that yourself. Cash transaction, as is, no further discussion. You said those words." Silence. "Have a good day," Walter said, and ended the call. Beverly Crane called him on a Friday afternoon in the 6th week. Walter was under a 2009 F-150 when his phone rang. He rolled out, wiped his hands, and answered it. "The Munich authentication is complete," she said. "Combined with the dendrochronology and the varnish analysis, we have strong provenance. My professional opinion is that this is an August Ferrer, circa 1939, in restorable condition." Walter sat down on the creeper, right there on the shop floor. "What does that mean?" he said. "In terms of, I've spoken to a colleague at a major auction house," Beverly Crane said. based on the provenance narrative, the condition, and current market appetite for discovered instruments. The estimate is between $800,000 and $1.2 million. Walter stared at the underside of the F-150. They want to feature it, Beverly Crane continued. The story is remarkable. The Texas sergeant, the Dresden Atelier, the letter in Leipzig. They believe it will generate significant press attention, if bidding goes well. She paused. I've seen instruments like this exceed their estimates considerably when the story captures attention. How considerably? Walter said. There's no way to know, she said, but I want you to be prepared. The auction was held 6 weeks later in a room in Dallas that Walter had never been to before and would not have been allowed into, in his normal life, without an invitation. He wore a jacket his wife had bought him for their anniversary, the year before she got sick. He'd had it cleaned and pressed. It still fit. He sat in the back of the room with Beverly Crane beside him, and he watched the room fill up with people who had not, 2 months ago, known that this instrument existed. Serena was with his neighbor, Mrs. Albrecht, whose mower Walter had fixed at least 4 times and who had never once charged him for the jam she sent home with him every Christmas. The bidding opened at $600,000. Walter watched the numbers climb, the way he watched an engine temp gauge, steadily with attention, not letting himself react until he understood what he was seeing. 700, 850, a phone bidder from overseas came in at 900 and held. A woman in the third row bid 1.1. The phone bidder went to 1.3. The woman in the third row did not respond. The hammer came down at $1.3 million. Walter looked at his hands. They were clean, he'd scrubbed them twice, but the creases in his knuckles were still faintly dark, the way they always were, the way they had always been. He thought that was all right. He heard about Conrad Kellner through Beverly Crane, who heard it from the auction house, who had received 2 calls from Conrad Kellner's lawyer in the weeks before the sale, inquiries about ownership, about the original transaction, about whether the sale could be contested. The auction house had reviewed the facts. Cash transaction. Completed sale. As explicitly stated by the seller. The lawyer had gone quiet after that. There was one more thing Beverly Crane told him, almost as an afterthought, at the end of a phone call in the week after the auction. Conrad Kellner's shop had been open for 22 years. In the months following the sale, the story had circulated. The way stories circulate now, quickly and widely, and without mercy. And 3 separate appraisers had come forward to say they had brought instruments to Conrad Kellner over the years and been told, in the same flat, certain voice, that the items were worth nothing. 2 of those appraisers had taken the items elsewhere and found differently. By the following spring, Kellner Fine Instruments had closed. The sign came down on a Tuesday. Nobody marked the occasion. Walter did 2 things with the money. The first thing he did was put enough away that Serena's college would be paid for, fully, regardless of what happened between now and then. He set that aside before anything else. Before he let himself think about the rest. Her mother had not gone to college because her family couldn't manage it, and she had made peace with that, but Walter had watched her make peace with it, and he had promised himself, in the quiet way he made promises, that Serena would never have to make that same peace. The second thing he did was have the fence built. It was a good fence. Cedar pickets, properly set posts, a gate with a latch that actually worked. He spent one Saturday afternoon walking the perimeter of the yard with Serena, and she ran her hand along the boards the whole way around, and when she got back to the gate, she looked up at him and said, "Now we can get a dog." He had known she was going to say that. He had been prepared for it for weeks. "Yeah," he said, "now we can get a dog." She picked one out the following Saturday from a rescue shelter 2 towns over, a 2-year-old black lab mix with one slightly crooked ear, and an immediate, absolute conviction that Walter's lap was the correct place to be at all times. Serena named him something Walter could barely pronounce and immediately shortened to Mac, which the dog accepted without objection. On a Tuesday evening in November, Walter sat on the back porch with Mac at his feet and a cup of coffee in his hand, and he watched Serena run laps in the fenced yard in the fading light, laughing at something that didn't need an explanation. And he thought about a Tuesday morning in January when he had almost taken the short way to school. He thought about a man in a cream-colored shirt who had looked at him and seen a transaction already concluded, someone with dirty hands and no particular future, someone who could be safely dismissed. He thought about his father's voice. Look at the thing itself, not what someone tells you it is. The thing itself. The coffee was warm. The yard was quiet except for Serena and the dog. The fence stood straight against the last of the light. Walter Pruitt looked at the thing itself. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, he thought, exactly what it had always been. He had just needed time and silence and stubbornness to see it clearly.